For years, the HOA swore my property lines were exactly where they said. At least until the day I tore out my old rotting fence and uncovered something they never expected. Overnight, the board that had ignored my complaints, dismissed my documents, and threatened me with fines, suddenly scrambled to stop me. Neighbors peeked through blinds, rumors spread like wildfire, and the board president showed up shaking with anger. All because of one discovery buried in the dirt, something that would cost them far more than they ever imagined. So what did I uncover that sent the entire HOA into a panic? Before everything spiraled into chaos, life in the neighborhood felt almost deceptively calm. The kind of place where morning routines were predictable, where the quiet hum of lawnmowers blended with birdsong, and where people waved out of habit more than genuine warmth. The houses were close enough to feel communal, but spaced just far enough apart to give everyone the illusion of privacy. It was the sort of suburban balance that looked perfect on paper. One of those communities marketed as peaceful, orderly, and meticulously maintained. The homeowner had settled there because it seemed safe, stable, predictable. The cul-de sac had the charm of tidy flower beds, trimmed hedges, and mailboxes that all matched like they'd been produced in a single afternoon. This was a place where the HOA promised fairness, structure, and community pride. And for a while, it seemed believable. Annual fees were reasonable. Monthly newsletters were filled with cheerful reminders about seasonal decor guidelines and community yard sales. Nothing felt threatening or overbearing. At least, not at first. The homeowner's life followed a comforting rhythm. Early morning coffee on the back porch. Weekend barbecues with a few friendly neighbors who didn't take themselves too seriously. Evenings spent tending to the garden at the back of the property, a small but meaningful space bordered by an aging wooden fence that had stood long before the current HOA board ever existed. Behind that fence, the homeowner had found a sense of peace. It was a boundary not just of property, but of personal comfort. Something about its presence made the yard feel like a private haven, tucked away from the obligations and expectations that lived on the other side. But quiet communities often have undercurrents. Sometimes they build slowly, stirring right beneath the surface long before anyone notices. And in this neighborhood, the first hints came in subtle forms. Small reminders slipped into HOA newsletters about maintaining visual cohesion and respecting communal boundaries. Notes that seemed harmless to most residents, but struck a strange chord with homeowner, who had long known that the property lines behind the fence were a little different than the HOA's generic community map suggested. It wasn't a secret. The homeowner had documents from the original survey, papers passed down from the previous owners, outlining the unusual shape of the lot. The fence had been built precisely to match those lines decades earlier, and no one had ever questioned it. Not until new leadership took over the HOA, people who seemed more interested in asserting authority than protecting property values. They were the type who walked the neighborhood with clipboards, not out of service, but out of pride. At first, the homeowner brushed off the shifting tone. It wasn't worth worrying about. Life was busy, and richer than anything that could be disrupted by a group of neighbors with a rule book. The backyard remained the same comfortable sanctuary. The property line was something barely worth a passing thought. The fence, though weathered, still stood strong enough to offer the promise of privacy. Yet small things began to happen. Little inconsistencies. The homeowner noticed HOA board members pausing just a bit too long near the side yard during their rounds. A few neighbors mentioned, casually, in passing, that the board had brought up property boundaries in recent meetings. Nothing definitive, nothing outright alarming, but it was clear something was shifting in the neighborhood's dynamic. The HOA had become more active, more meticulous, and noticeably more focused on compliance. They issued new reminders about paint shades, mailbox heights, and trash bin placement. It was as if the board was working overtime to redefine what order looked like in the community. Some residents quietly grumbled, others conformed without question. The homeowner stayed in the middle, not wanting conflict but unwilling to be pushed around. Still, the fence lingered in the back of their mind. Its age was becoming more noticeable. Panels bowing slightly, color fading from years of storms and sun. It wasn't falling apart, but it was nearing the time when a decision would need to be made. Repair it or replace it entirely. A normal task for any homeowner, but one that suddenly felt heavier given the HOA's newfound obsession with boundaries and conformity. It wasn't until a seasonal inspection notice appeared that the tension became harder to ignore. The HOA scheduled a property-wide check, one that would include yard borders, exterior maintenance, and structural updates. It was a routine event, but this year, the homeowner felt an unmistakable sense of unease. There was something pointed about the way the announcement was written, something almost targeted. Like the board was quietly waiting for the opportunity to bring up the fence. The day of the inspection came and went without immediate issues. No warnings, no fines, no reason to think anything was wrong. But the way the board members lingered near the back corner of the lot, murmuring to one another while looking at the fence, was something the homeowner couldn't shake. They didn't say anything, not directly, but their expressions made it clear. They believed something was off. Life went back to its routines, but the peace of the neighborhood felt thinner now, stretched slightly at the edges. The homeowner began researching fence replacement options, partly out of necessity and partly as a precaution. They pulled out the old survey documents, revisiting the familiar lines just to reassure themselves that everything was still as they remembered. And it was. The measurements were clear. The boundaries were unmistakable. Nothing had changed, except the HOA's attitude. What the homeowner didn't know then was that replacing the worn-down fence would trigger a chain of events that would expose years of incompetence, arrogance, and mismanagement within the HOA. A simple home improvement would become the spark that revealed how deeply rooted the board's obsession with control truly was. And it all started with that aging fence quietly standing at the back of an ordinary suburban yard, waiting for the moment everything would erupt. The decision to replace the fence came with a strange mix of relief and apprehension. The homeowner wanted the job finished before the next storm season, before the wood finally gave out on its own terms. Contractors were scheduled, materials selected, and the project felt simple, routine. But in HOA neighborhoods, even the most ordinary plans could become a battlefield. And this project was no exception. The morning the contractors arrived, the neighborhood was already awake with the subtle hum of curiosity. Garage doors cracked open just enough for someone to peek through. A few residents walked their dogs past the property, more times than usual, each pass slower than the last. The homeowner tried to ignore the attention, focusing instead on the workers measuring out the boundary, exactly as outlined in the survey documents. It didn't take long before the first complication appeared. A white SUV rolled to a stop across the street, and from it stepped one of the HOA board members, the one who always seemed eager to escalate small issues into big ones if it meant reinforcing her authority. She didn't speak, merely stood there watching, arms folded, tapping her foot as if waiting for the contractors to make a single wrong move. Her presence alone shifted the air, turning what should have been a straightforward renovation into something heavy and tense. The contractors continued marking the line, and they worked with confidence. They had the survey in hand, and followed it precisely. But every time they placed a stake along the boundary, the board member's expression hardened. She scribbled notes into a little notebook she carried everywhere, her eyes narrowing at each measurement. It was clear she believed she had caught the homeowner doing something wrong, even if she didn't yet understand what she was looking at. Hours later, she finally left, but the damage had already settled into the homeowner's nerves. It was obvious. The HOA wasn't going to let this fence replacement be easy. And that suspicion was confirmed. The next morning when an official letter arrived, the notice was written with the cold, sterile tone HOAs often used when they felt powerful. It stated that all construction on the property must cease immediately pending an investigation into potential boundary encroachment. The phrasing was deliberate, broad enough to give the board room to maneuver, vague enough to create confusion. But the message behind it was perfectly clear. The HOA believed the homeowner was building the fence on land that didn't belong to them. Frustration simmered. The homeowner reread the survey documents, checked measurements, and confirmed everything with the contractors. There was no mistake. But the HOA didn't need proof to cause trouble, they only needed suspicion. And once suspicion took root among the board, the pressure began to intensify. The first escalation came in the form of fines. The HOA claimed the homeowner had begun unauthorized construction, even though they had submitted the required request weeks earlier. The board now argued the approval was under review, though they had previously stamped it with their formal signature. It was a move designed to create a technicality where none existed. A game of rules twisted to suit their motives. More letters followed. Daily warnings. Threats of further fines. Claims that the property lines were in dispute. The board insisted the homeowner needed to halt all work until a new survey, one performed by a company, approved by the HOA, could be conducted. They argued it was necessary for community cohesion. But it was obvious their urgency wasn't about boundaries. It was about control. The homeowner considered pausing the project, but ultimately decided against it. The old fence had already been dismantled, and the property was exposed. Leaving the yard open meant pets couldn't be let out and privacy was suddenly gone. The safest option was to continue building, especially since the homeowner had the legal documents to prove the work was on their land. But moving forward only intensified the HOA's anger. Over the next week, the board members made frequent visits to the property, often walking as close to the boundary as possible without technically trespassing. They stood there with clipboards, taking measurements with tape measures that wobbled in the wind, as if hoping to find evidence of wrongdoing through sheer determination. The spectacle grew so frequent that neighbors began whispering about it, curious but unwilling to intervene. Soon, the interference escalated to a point that felt less like oversight and more like intimidation. One board member took pictures of the construction site from multiple angles, sometimes stepping onto the homeowner's grass, before quickly stepping back again. Another lingered behind the contractor's truck, attempting to photograph their license plate. It was harassment disguised as documentation. The homeowner kept calm on the surface, but internally, a fire grew. it wasn't just about the fence anymore. It was about the principle of not allowing a group of overreaching board members to rewrite property lines that had been legally established decades earlier. But just as frustration turned into determination, the HOA delivered the blow they likely believed would force the homeowner to surrender. They issued a violation claiming the new fence was encroaching into common HOA property. Despite having no proof, they cited an outdated HOA map, the same inaccurate one that ignored the irregular shape of the homeowner's lot, and used it as justification to demand the fence be removed entirely. They gave the homeowner 10 days to comply or face escalating fines and possible legal action. It was an impossible demand. The fence was halfway built, and the contractors were scheduled to return the next day. Removing it would not only cost thousands of dollars, but also leave the property exposed for weeks. And worst of all, complying would essentially allow the HOA to claim land that wasn't theirs. The tension became unbearable. Every day brought new letters with bold red headers. Every evening brought more board members strolling by, pretending not to stare. Every morning, the homeowner woke up with a knot in their stomach, waiting for the next escalation. And then, the cliffhanger moment arrived. The moment when everything shifted from annoyance to a full-blown battle. While marking the final post placements, the contractors discovered something buried several inches underground, an old metal survey stake. Rusted, worn, but unmistakably official. And it was exactly where the homeowner's documents said the boundary should be. The discovery wasn't a surprise to the homeowner. They knew their documents were accurate. But to the contractors, it was confirmation that the HOA's accusations were baseless. But the real shock came when they found a second stake farther along the line, and then a third. The entire boundary was marked. It had been there for decades, untouched and undeniable. The homeowner took photos, captured video, documented everything. For the first time since the conflict began, there was a sense of solid ground beneath them. Literally and figuratively, they now had irrefutable proof that the HOA was wrong. But proof didn't mean the HOA would back down. Within 24 hours, the board delivered a new letter. This time, the tone was noticeably more aggressive. They claimed that any underground markers were outdated and did not reflect modern HOA boundaries. It was a last-ditch attempt to hold on to their stance, twisting logic into a shape that only made sense to those desperate to preserve their authority. But the homeowner understood something in that moment. The HOA wasn't going to stop unless they were forced to. They had made up their minds long before the fence was ever removed. This wasn't a misunderstanding or clerical issue. It was a power play, pure and simple. And now the homeowner had to figure out how far they were willing to go to fight it. The pressure continued building. Neighbors who once waved politely now watched from their porches with anxious curiosity. Some whispered their support privately, knowing the HOA had overstepped but fearful of being targeted next. Others remained staunchly silent, preferring not to be involved in anything that might disrupt their carefully cultivated peace. As construction continued, the HOA's desperation became increasingly obvious. They announced emergency meetings. They sent out community-wide reminders about respecting shared spaces. They even circulated a poorly drawn map implying that several homeowners, though clearly targeting just one, had expanded property beyond authorized limits. It was a thinly veiled accusation, and everyone in the neighborhood understood exactly who it referenced. But still, the homeowner didn't back down. They knew the truth was buried in the dirt, and now they had the evidence to prove it. Yet the conflict was far from over. The HOA wasn't finished. They had one more move planned. One final escalation, meant to break the homeowners' resistance and reclaim their sense of authority. It was a tactic they had used before on other residents. A tactic that blurred the lines between policy enforcement and outright bullying. And when the homeowner discovered what the HOA planned next, the entire dispute exploded into something none of them could have predicted. The air was thick with anticipation as the day of the HOA's so-called final review arrived. The homeowner felt a mix of dread and determination, knowing that months of harassment, fines, and intimidation had led to this exact moment. It wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about the principle of standing up to arbitrary power and demanding accountability. The board members, as if sensing the gravity of the day, arrived early, clipboards in hand, murmuring among themselves with that same air of self-importance that had fueled the conflict from the start. The homeowner stepped into the backyard, surveying the half-completed fence, the stakes marking the property lines, and the evidence that had been painstakingly documented. Every photograph, every survey document, every video clip of the contractors at work now served as silent witnesses. It was clear the homeowner had done nothing wrong. The question was whether the HOA would acknowledge it, or escalate one last time. The first confrontation came almost immediately. The board president, a woman whose confidence had seemed unshakable until now, strode across the lawn, her face tight with barely concealed frustration. She pointed at a corner post, claiming it encroached on HOA property, and demanding the work stop immediately. She waved an official-looking map in front of the homeowner. But the homeowner had anticipated this. Pulling out the original survey, side by side with the markers now visible in the dirt, the homeowner calmly showed the board exactly where the boundary lay. For a brief moment, silence fell over the yard. The contractors paused, holding their tools. The board members shuffled papers nervously, glancing at each other. The homeowner's calm confidence was a stark contrast to their rising panic. They realized that the physical proof, the rusted stakes, the survey documents, and the meticulously measured posts, was indisputable. And in that moment, the board's authority began to falter. But the HOA wasn't ready to concede. One member began citing vague community rules, clauses written in fine print, and obscure precedents. Every attempt to argue the homeowner had violated a rule became more desperate and less coherent. Their voice grew louder, their gestures more animated, as if sheer volume could somehow impose compliance. The homeowner, however, remained steady, refusing to be drawn into a shouting match. Every argument the HOA made was countered silently by the evidence in front of them. The tension was palpable, a charged current vibrating through every corner of the property. The situation escalated when the board president, losing patience, tried to take matters into her own hands. She stepped closer to the fence, attempting to pull a stake out of the ground, insisting that it had been improperly placed. The homeowner moved swiftly, standing between her and the stake, insisting that only licensed surveyors could interfere with property markers. For a moment, the confrontation teetered on the edge of chaos. The board member's face flushed with anger, and it became clear she had underestimated the homeowner's resolve. Then came the turning point. The homeowner had anticipated the possibility of legal escalation and had already filed a formal complaint with the county property office. Within moments of the board's interference, a county surveyor arrived, clipboard in hand, calm but authoritative. Measuring tapes extended, levels were placed, and the surveyor walked the exact line dictated by decades-old documents. The board members watched, stiff and silent, as each measurement confirmed the homeowner's claim. Every corner post, every stake, every section of the fence was on the homeowner's land. Legally, indisputably. For the first time, the board's confidence cracked visibly. The president's hands trembled slightly as she tried to argue, citing errors in documentation that no one could substantiate. A younger board member whispered something under his breath, and the homeowner noticed the doubt flickering in his eyes. The surveyor, professional and impartial, placed a final mark at the edge of the property line and turned to the HOA. The words were blunt, but undeniable. The homeowner's fence was entirely on their property. Any claim to the contrary was baseless. The humiliation for the HOA was immediate and intense. Members who had strutted around with authority for months now looked like they had been caught in a charade. They stammered, attempting to save face, but every attempt at rationalization was crushed by the cold, factual evidence. Neighbors, who had been watching from windows and porches, began to murmur in astonishment. The tension in the cul-de-sac shifted visibly. Whispers of the board's incompetence began spreading, yet the homeowner wasn't finished. Months of harassment had left emotional scars, and they knew that a true victory required more than just proof. It required accountability, pulling out the complete record of HOA correspondence, letters, emails, photos, and videos. The homeowner methodically laid out the timeline of interference, fines, and intimidation. Each document told the story of the board's obsession with control. Each photo captured moments of petty harassment. The homeowner didn't speak harshly, they didn't need to. The weight of the evidence, presented clearly and calmly, spoke for itself. Neighbors began to peek closer, some shaking their heads, others murmuring in disbelief. The board's previous authority felt fragile, as if a carefully constructed facade was crumbling. The president attempted to interject, claiming intentions were misunderstood, but the homeowner's documentation left no room for excuses. Every action, every threat, every violation of procedure was recorded and undeniable. In a moment that would define the neighborhood's history, the homeowner took the final, decisive step. They requested that the board issue a public acknowledgement of their error and rescind all fines associated with the fence dispute. The request wasn't framed as a threat, it was framed as fact. The HOA had acted outside its authority, disrupted the peace of the community, and caused unnecessary financial and emotional stress. The board faltered. Private arguments erupted among members. Some wanted to resist, to maintain the illusion of control, but the evidence, and the surveyor's impartial testimony, made resistance futile. The board president finally acquiesced, her voice tight and formal, offering a reluctant acknowledgement that the homeowner had acted entirely within their rights. It wasn't a full apology, but it was a concession that could not be undone. The homeowner allowed themselves a moment of quiet satisfaction, knowing the months of tension, fines, and intimidation had finally reached their apex, and that justice had, at long last, been served. But the emotional climax wasn't just in the acknowledgement. It was in the sense of vindication, of standing firm when every attempt had been made to bully them into submission. The homeowner had turned the tables, not with anger, but with calm persistence, meticulous documentation, and unwavering resolve. Neighbors, emboldened by the homeowner's victory, began to speak more openly about the board's overreach. Whispered complaints turned into public conversations, reshaping the community dynamic. The HOA, once untouchable in itself, proclaimed authority, had been revealed as fallible, petty, and constrained by the very rules it claimed to enforce. And yet, as the homeowner stood back and surveyed the nearly completed fence, the clean wood, the precise lines, the boundary finally respected, they realized that this victory was just one battle in a larger war against complacency in neighborhood governance. The fence was a symbol, yes, but it was also a warning when power is unchecked, persistence, truth, and patience can topple even the most rigid institutions. The final moment of tension came when the board president, still red-faced, tried to leave the property quietly. But the homeowner followed up with a final challenge, a request for all future correspondence regarding the fence or property boundaries to be conducted formally, in writing, and with transparency. It was a move designed to prevent further intimidation and to signal that the homeowner would no longer be bullied. The president's silence, the stiff nod from the surveyor, and the murmurs of neighbors watching from porches confirmed the homeowner had achieved a complete, undeniable victory. And just as the homeowner took a deep breath, looking at the last few posts being secured into place, there was a fleeting, almost surreal realization: the months of fear, frustration, and near constant tension had culminated not in chaos, but in empowerment. They had turned the HOA's own obsession with rules into a tool for justice. They had taken a small, quiet piece of land, a fence, a boundary, and transformed it into a public reckoning, exposing the absurdity of arbitrary authority for all to see. Yet beneath the satisfaction, one thought lingered, a question that would haunt the quiet corners of the neighborhood and echo in every HOA meeting from that point forward. If one homeowner could stand up and reveal the board's mistakes so decisively, how many other abuses of power were still hidden behind the polished facades of compliance and order? The homeowner stepped back from the fence, surveying the clean lines and solid posts, feeling the weight of months lift from their shoulders. The board retreated, defeated but unwilling to admit the full extent of their errors, leaving the homeowner with not just a completed fence, but a story of patience, persistence, and triumph. And as the surveyor packed up, nodding respectfully, the homeowner knew that while the fence marked the edge of their property, it also symbolized the boundary they had drawn in the conflict, no longer silent, no longer intimidated, and fully prepared to defend what was theirs. The battle was won. The board had been humbled. But the question remained: how far would the HOA go in the future when challenged by someone who refused to back down? The dust had barely settled after the confrontation when the homeowner finally allowed themselves to step back and breathe. For months, the fence had symbolized more than a simple boundary. It had been a battleground for autonomy, dignity, and fairness. And now, with the posts firmly in the ground and the surveyor's confirmation in hand, there was a tangible sense of closure. At least, on the surface. But the true resolution went far deeper than the neat lines of cedar and pine. It rippled across the neighborhood, reshaping relationships, expectations, and the balance of power. In the days following the climactic showdown, the homeowner began noticing subtle shifts in the atmosphere of the community. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact while walking past were now stopping to chat, cautiously at first, then with more warmth. Many admitted, in hushed tones, that they had long felt the board's overreach, but had been too intimidated to speak up. Seeing someone stand firm, armed with facts and patience, had given them a kind of collective courage. Conversations that had once been whispered behind closed doors spilled into porches, yards, and even informal gatherings, slowly transforming the previously tense social dynamic of the cul-de-sac. The HOA board itself was irrevocably changed. Publicly, they were forced to issue an acknowledgement that the homeowner had acted entirely within their rights, and fines were formally rescinded. Behind closed doors, the mood was far more chaotic. The president's authority, once unquestioned, was now openly challenged. Board members who had previously wielded rules as weapons found themselves scrutinized, their decisions questioned, their motives analyzed. Internal arguments erupted about how to prevent future embarrassments, and several members quietly considered stepping down rather than facing further public scrutiny. The HOA's once iron grip on the neighborhood had loosened, and the homeowner's victory had set a precedent for accountability that could not easily be undone. With the fence finally complete, the homeowner took a quiet walk along the perimeter of their property, running a hand over the smooth cedar boards and the precise line of the posts. There was a sense of peace in the work itself, but also a lingering awareness of the cost it had taken to get there. Emotional fatigue, financial strain, and countless hours spent documenting, photographing, and corresponding with the board had left marks that no surveyor could measure. The homeowner knew that boundaries were not just physical, they were emotional and social as well, and the fight for them had exacted a toll. But in that moment, surveying the line they had defended so fiercely, the homeowner felt a profound sense of empowerment. A reminder that standing up for oneself, though exhausting, could yield victories far larger than the immediate goal. The story of the fence quickly became a point of conversation throughout the neighborhood. Word spread not only about the homeowner's victory, but also about the board's increasingly desperate tactics. Some neighbors admitted that they had previously complied unquestioningly with HOA demands, afraid of fines, confrontation, or social ostracism. Seeing someone challenge the system and succeed inspired a subtle, quiet rebellion. Neighbors began questioning minor rules, scrutinizing citations, and even attending board meetings with renewed scrutiny. It was as if the act of defending one property had shifted the neighborhood's collective consciousness, planting seeds of accountability and vigilance that would influence interactions for years to come. Financially, the homeowner had made strategic decisions that allowed them to maintain their ground without overextending themselves. While the confrontation had caused delays and the need to engage surveyors, the carefully documented evidence meant that they avoided paying the fines the board had levied. In the end, the project cost was slightly higher than anticipated, but the payoff was both practical and symbolic: a solid, attractive fence marking the boundary clearly and permanently, and an undeniable statement of their rights. As a property owner, the investment was not just in wood and nails, it was in autonomy and dignity. The HOA's credibility, conversely, suffered long-term damage. Their initial aggressiveness and refusal to acknowledge the surveyor's findings left a lingering impression of incompetence and overreach. Residents who had once viewed the board as infallible now saw them as flawed, occasionally petty, and capable of abusing authority when unchecked. Meeting attendance patterns changed subtly. More residents began attending monthly sessions, not out of curiosity alone, but with a new determination to hold the board accountable. Some homeowners even submitted proposals for reforms, advocating for clearer rules, transparent processes, and mechanisms for dispute resolution that did not rely on intimidation. The homeowner's stand had catalyzed systemic change, a ripple effect far beyond the fence itself. Emotionally, the homeowner experienced a mix of triumph and exhaustion. Months of tension, worry, and harassment had left scars, but they were paired with a profound sense of justice achieved. There was satisfaction in seeing the board humbled, vindication in knowing that patience and persistence had won the day, and relief in reclaiming the sense of safety and autonomy over their property. More subtly, there was pride in the demonstration of personal integrity. The homeowner had resisted the urge to escalate with anger or rash decisions, instead relying on methodical documentation, calm persistence, and legal accuracy. The conflict, while stressful, had reinforced a key lesson about measured resistance. Power is often less about aggression and more about steadfastness in the face of intimidation. Over time, the neighborhood began to adjust to a new equilibrium. The fence became not only a physical boundary, but also a symbol of the homeowner's resolve. Children and pets roamed freely without fear of encroachment. The yard regained privacy, and casual social interactions returned to a normal rhythm. The homeowners, who had once quiet observers of the HOA's behavior, began participating in neighborhood committees. Inspired by the knowledge that their voices mattered and that resistance to overreach could succeed, the balance of power shifted subtly, but permanently. Authority was no longer unquestionable, and residents felt a renewed sense of agency in shaping the rules and culture of their community. The HOA, for its part, took tentative steps toward reform. Some members voluntarily stepped down. Others proposed changes to bylaws to prevent future disputes of this nature, and a few even privately apologized for the stress caused. Yet there remained a collective wariness. The board had learned, perhaps too late, that attempts to assert control without transparency and fairness could lead to public humiliation. The homeowner's victory had become a cautionary tale for the organization itself. A reminder that overreach can backfire spectacularly when confronted with evidence, persistence, and courage. In a broader sense, the homeowner's experience highlighted universal truths about community dynamics, power, and accountability. HOA rules, when applied fairly, can protect property values and maintain aesthetic consistency. But when rules are wielded arbitrarily, with selective enforcement, they become tools of control rather than protection. The homeowner's case demonstrated that knowledge, documentation, and patience are powerful weapons in the face of institutional overreach. It also underscored the importance of transparency and fairness. Communities thrive not when authority is absolute, but when it is accountable to those it governs. The personal transformation for the homeowner was equally significant. Having navigated months of intimidation, fines, and public scrutiny, they emerged with renewed confidence in their ability to advocate for themselves. There was a sense of empowerment that extended beyond property lines. If they could face down a powerful, entrenched board and prevail, other challenges, professional, social, or personal, felt more manageable. The fence had become a metaphor, not just for physical boundaries, but for the limits one sets in life against coercion and intimidation. It was a daily reminder that standing firm, even when isolated or pressured, could create meaningful change. Neighbors continued to reference the conflict months later, often in hushed tones at block parties or community gatherings. The homeowner, however, noticed a shift from gossip to admiration, from curiosity to respect. People who had once felt powerless began to feel empowered, inspired by the knowledge that one person's persistence could challenge entrenched authority and succeed. Conversations about rules, fairness, and governance became more common, and the neighborhood gradually developed a culture of oversight and mutual accountability that had been absent before. The homeowner's victory had created a community-wide lesson in resilience and vigilance. Even as the dust settled, there were lingering reflections. The homeowner recognized that while the HOA had been exposed and humbled, vigilance was necessary. Power could easily revert to overreach if residents allowed complacency to creep back in. Yet this awareness was paired with hope. The knowledge that communities could change when individuals were willing to act, armed with facts and resolve, offered a blueprint for future disputes. The fence had been won. But more importantly, the culture of the neighborhood had shifted, creating space for dialogue, fairness, and respect. The final, enduring impact was subtle yet profound. Where once the cul-de-sac had been tense, wary, and divided, it now carried an undercurrent of cautious optimism. Neighbors were more willing to engage, more willing to ask questions, more willing to demand accountability from those in positions of authority. The homeowner, once isolated in their struggle, became a quiet example of courage, diligence, and the importance of standing firm for what is right. And while the board retained formal authority, its moral authority had been forever diminished, replaced with a reminder that unchecked power could be held to account. In the quiet evenings, as the homeowner gazed across the neatly finished fence, they reflected on the months of struggle and tension that had brought them here. The posts stood straight and solid, the cedar smooth and warm in the fading sunlight, and the property line clear and uncontested. It was more than a boundary, it was a testament to patience, documentation, and unwavering resolve. Every battle had left its mark, but the victory had been worth every ounce of effort, every sleepless night, and every moment of anxiety. And in that stillness, one thought lingered, a rhetorical question that crystallized the story's true impact. If one determined homeowner could stand up to an entire board, armed only with patience, facts, and courage, how much stronger could a community become when every resident refused to accept injustice silently? The fence was complete. The HOA had been humbled. And a neighborhood, once complacent, now carried a quiet but enduring lesson. Power is never absolute when met with determination, and fairness will prevail when courage refuses to be silenced. The homeowner walked back into the house, the setting sun casting long shadows over the property line, knowing that this battle had been won. Yet the story would linger, whispered in conversations, referenced in meetings, and remembered as a turning point for the community. A fence had divided land, but it had united resolve, integrity, and a newfound sense of agency. And that, ultimately, was the most enduring victory of all.